I didn't return home in search of inspiration or with the faint hope of finding a new story in these old walls. I came back because I was exhausted, tired of it all. Years of travel had worn me down, turning me into a weary wanderer with no final destination in sight. Hotel rooms that all looked the same, faceless cities where I felt lost every time. My passion for writing had withered, and the words that once flowed effortlessly from my pen now eluded me. I could no longer write. That's how I ended up here, in the old family home on the outskirts of a sleepy English countryside, where the tall trees and winding garden paths whispered of forgotten memories. I hadn't set foot here in 5 years, perhaps more. I had no hopes, no plans, but still I decided to return, to the place where everything began. My father met me at the door without a word. He had always been a man of few words, and our relationship had always been strained, especially after we lost my mother. We had both grieved her absence, but it manifested in us differently. I escaped into books, into writing, trying to flee reality. He buried himself in his work, turning our home into a hollow fortress. We hadn't spoken in years, yet he still allowed me to return. He didn't ask about my failures, and I didn't try to explain why I was here. On the second day after my return, I discovered that he had remarried. Her name was Helena. She was 48 but looked a decade younger. Tall, graceful, with an elegance that seemed effortless. She fit into this house as though she had always lived here. At first, I kept my distance, observing her from afar. She seemed kind and welcoming, always smiling as she tried to make the house feel warmer. Meanwhile, I remained bitter and empty, hiding in my room with my notebooks that remained blank. Much like myself, my days passed in a monotonous blur. I would wake early, when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, and head to the kitchen where Helena was already preparing breakfast. Her voice was always warm, but I would respond curtly, with a strained politeness. I would then retreat to the garden and attempt to write, but the words refused to come. They melted away like morning mist, leaving only emptiness in their wake. Over time, I began to notice her more. How she carefully arranged flowers for the vase on the table. How she would quietly laugh while reading an old book on the terrace. Her voice was so calm and melodic that I couldn't help but listen to every word when she spoke to my father about her plans for the day. And yet, I wouldn't let myself get too close. I was a stranger in this house, where everything now belonged to her. One afternoon, I was in the library, trying to draw inspiration from the old books lining the shelves, when Helena entered with a cup of tea. "I thought you might like this," she said, offering the cup. I looked up, surprised. There was no pity or judgment in her eyes, only genuine care. Caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. I simply nodded and stared down at the open book in front of me, not reading a single word. Thus, the days went by. My father was often away on business trips, leaving the two of us alone in the house. Helena remained as polite and gracious as ever, never overstepping her bounds. She would read on the terrace or tend to the garden while I wandered among the trees, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease growing inside me. She was always there, but never intrusive. And the more I tried to keep my distance, the more I felt drawn to her. I attempted to write. I had notebooks, pens, an old laptop, but no inspiration. I would sit in my room staring at the blank screen or roam the garden searching for some spark of creativity. Yet, as before, the words refused to appear. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped between a past that haunted me and a future I could no longer envision. One morning, after another sleepless night, I went out to the garden and found her there. She was sitting on a bench, reading, and when she saw me, she smiled. "I found something you might like," she said, handing me a book of Rilke's poetry. I took it, unable to tear my gaze away from her eyes. They were so clear, so sincere, and I felt something new stir within me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the beginning of something unknown, yet undeniably real. But I had no idea how far it would take us, how it would intertwine our fates in a dangerous game of feelings and forbidden desires from which there would be no escape. Time passed, and our routine remained almost unchanged. I still woke up early, went out to the garden, and tried to write. The words stubbornly refused to come, but that no longer troubled me as much. Each day, I found myself thinking of her, of Helena, more and more. She seemed like a ghost in this house, a quiet presence that made my heart race every time our eyes met by chance. My father, as usual, disappeared on his business trips, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. When he was home, we barely spoke. Breakfasts were quiet, dinners filled only with formal conversations about the weather or news that I hardly listened to. My entire existence revolved around not revealing my feelings. I was afraid Helena would read them in my eyes. Yet, the more time we spent alone, the harder it became for me to hide my emotions. She was always so kind, always ready to support me. Her advice on literature, her soft voice when she talked about her favorite books or the meaning of Rilke's poems, stirred a tightly coiled spring of longing within me that I could not control. One evening, when my father had once again gone to London, we were left alone in the house. I tried to keep my distance, hiding in my room with yet another hopeless attempt to write something. But the words once again eluded me, and I threw my pen down in frustration, tossing my notebook onto the floor. I could feel the silence beginning to eat away at me from the inside. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the door. It was her. "Liam, would you like to take a walk with me?" Helena asked, standing in the doorway, her voice so soft it seemed she was afraid to disturb my solitude. I didn't know how to respond, but her eyes, they glowed with a warmth that broke down all my inner barriers. I nodded, and together we stepped out onto the terrace, where the soft glow of the sunset illuminated her face. We walked through the garden, and I felt my heart pounding wildly every time she accidentally brushed her hand against mine. "How's your book?" she asked, looking at me with genuine interest, and I felt a pang of guilt for not being able to tell her the truth. I could no longer write. "I'm trying," I replied, trying to avoid her gaze. "Sometimes the words only come when you stop searching for them," she said, stopping to smell one of the rose bushes. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her silhouette, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. From that evening, everything changed. I could no longer escape my feelings. Whenever we were alone, I could feel an invisible thread tightening between us, becoming thinner, more fragile, as if it was on the verge of breaking at any moment. Helena made no overt moves towards me, but her looks, her soft touches, when she accidentally brushed my shoulder or hand, were enough to drive me mad. I began taking long walks in the forest that surrounded our home, trying to escape these feelings. But no matter where I went, I always found myself coming back to her. Her image haunted me like a shadow, even in the most distant corners of the woods. I could have confessed my feelings to her, but I feared it would ruin everything. I was afraid to lose that delicate thread that connected us. One day, we were left alone in the house for an entire week. My father had gone to a conference, and I knew we would be alone, but I couldn't run away. I tried to keep my distance, but it was impossible. Every evening, we would sit together in the library, and I could feel something invisible drawing us closer and closer. One evening, she asked me to help her move some old books from the attic. Together, we climbed the narrow stairs, and I could smell her perfume, which clouded my thoughts. At one point, as we stood close, she accidentally brushed my face, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so simple, yet so warm, that I froze. Our eyes met, and I saw in hers the same thing I felt within myself. It was like a quiet explosion inside me. There were no words between us, only that soft gaze that lasted an eternity. And in a moment, as if driven by some invisible force, I leaned in toward her, and our lips touched. It was a quick, uncertain kiss, but it changed everything. Helena pulled back, looking at me with wide eyes, but she said nothing. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and at the same time, I realized we had crossed a line from which there was no return. She quickly walked away, leaving me standing in the dark hallway, but I knew this was only the beginning. From that evening on, our relationship was different. We could no longer avoid each other. Every glance, every touch was filled with what we feared to acknowledge. And though I tried to flee into the woods, into my unfinished manuscripts, into my own solitude. Her image, her presence stayed with me always. This story was as dangerous as it was desirable, and I knew that we would both burn in its fire. From the evening when our lips first met, everything changed forever. We both knew we had crossed a line from which there was no return, yet neither of us dared to speak of it. The silence that enveloped our days was thick and heavy, but every glance, every accidental touch said more than any words ever could. It was as if we were dancing on the edge of a precipice, afraid to take a step forward and yet unable to stop. Now that my father had once again left on an extended business trip, we were alone in this enormous house. In the past, this solitude would have been an opportunity for me to delve into my thoughts, but now it was a test of my endurance. Every time we found ourselves alone in a room together, I could feel my heart beating wildly, my thoughts tangling into knots. It was as if we had become shadows of each other, constantly crossing paths but never speaking aloud about what was happening between us. I tried to focus on my work, pretending to get back to writing a novel, but inspiration refused to come. All my thoughts were consumed not with plots, but with her. Her image, her soft voice, the way she said my name, everything about her filled my mind. I couldn't work, couldn't think of anything else except our forbidden encounters. Our game of silent glances and accidental touches lasted for days, weeks. It was as if we were participants in a secret pact that existed only between the two of us. I didn't know how long this could continue, but I was sure of one thing. I could no longer contain my feelings. They were growing inside me, like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. One evening, as I sat in the library trying to write, once again staring at a blank page, she entered the room. The dim light of the desk lamp cast a soft glow over her figure, and I could barely tear my eyes away from her. She came closer, sat down across from me, and for a while, we simply looked at each other in silence. "How's the writing going?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid to break the fragile moment. "Not well," I confessed. "I can't seem to write anything. My thoughts, they're occupied with something else." I knew it was too transparent, but I could no longer hold back. Her expression changed. Her eyes dropped to the floor, and I could feel the tension between us tightening like a bowstring. "Liam," she began, but I wasn't listening anymore. I stood up, walked over to her, and without thinking, reached out to touch her cheek. She didn't pull away, simply closed her eyes as if allowing me this moment, and I kissed her. This time slowly, gently, as if trying to memorize every second. Our kisses became our shared secret, our only comfort in this house where everything else seemed so empty. Every time my father was away, we spent our days together. Long walks in the garden, reading aloud in the library, dinners that ended with warm embraces. I felt myself losing control, forgetting about everything except the moments we shared. But over time, it wasn't enough. I could no longer imagine my life without her. And although we continued to hide from reality, I began to think about what might come next. One day, as we sat on the terrace discussing a book, I gathered the courage to say, "Helena, why don't we run away together? Leave everything behind. We could travel, live as we wish." She looked at me in surprise, and I realized I had voiced the thoughts that had been brewing inside me for so long. Her eyes clouded over, and I could see her struggling with herself, trying to find the right words. "Liam, it sounds like a dream, but it's impossible. We don't have a future," she said so softly I could barely hear her. Her words were like a cold shower, a harsh reminder of the reality I had tried so hard to escape. After that conversation, I became even more withdrawn. I couldn't accept that our relationship was just a fleeting episode with no chance of lasting. We still spent time together, but I felt as if an invisible wall had grown between us. Her smiles became rarer, our conversations more restrained. But at night, when we were alone in the darkness of the house, all those doubts would vanish. We sought each other out, hiding from the rest of the world, knowing that every moment could be our last. And every time I looked into her eyes, I saw that same desire, that same hope that our nights could somehow turn into days. I knew that this house had become our prison. We had trapped ourselves here, running from reality, losing ourselves in this game of feelings. But the longer it lasted, the harder it became to imagine how it could ever end. I dreamed of things staying as they were, but deep down I understood we couldn't hide forever. Autumn was approaching, and the air grew colder. The leaves in the garden turned yellow and fell, like the illusion of our happiness slowly crumbling. I knew that soon, everything would change, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Perhaps we were doomed from the start, but I was willing to accept any outcome just to hold on to her a little longer. One day, after returning from a long walk, I found her on the terrace. She was sitting there, lost in her thoughts, and when I approached, she looked at me with sadness in her eyes. "We need to stop this, Liam," she said finally. "We can't go on living like this." I nodded silently, even though everything inside me screamed in protest. I didn't fully understand what her words meant, but I felt that our shared summer was coming to an end, and even though I tried to keep her close, I knew deep down that she was right. I woke at dawn, sensing that something had changed. The cold air seeping through the window seemed to pierce through to my bones. I reached for the book on my nightstand, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. But even the words, which once brought me comfort, now felt hollow. Something was wrong. Heading downstairs to the kitchen, I noticed Helena was nowhere to be found. She usually woke up before me, and we would share coffee on the terrace. But this morning, her place was empty, her cup still clean on the shelf. I tried to reassure myself. Perhaps she had gone for a walk to clear her thoughts. But as the hours passed, she didn't return. I wandered through the house, searching for any sign of her presence. But there was nothing. She had vanished, leaving behind only a silence that now felt deafening. When I went up to her room, I found something that made my heart stop. A sealed envelope with my name on it, resting on her vanity. My hands trembled as I opened the letter. The thin paper felt as if it might disintegrate with the slightest touch, but the words written in her elegant handwriting were clear. Asterisk Liam, I knew this day would come, but it doesn't make saying goodbye any easier. I can no longer pretend that we have a future. What we shared was beautiful and real, but at the same time it was so wrong. I can't keep living a lie, deceiving your father and myself. You asked me to run away with you, and perhaps if I were younger, braver, I would have said yes. But we cannot live in a world of illusions. Your father is not just my husband. He is someone who entrusted me with his life. I can't betray him any longer, no matter how much I want to be with you. Goodbye, Liam. Be happy, even if I can't be a part of your life. With love, Helena. Asterisk. I read the letter over and over, not believing what I was seeing. How could she leave so suddenly, abandoning me with all these unspoken feelings? My head spun, my heart pounded wildly, but no words were enough to express the pain I felt. I no longer knew how to breathe, how to exist without her. I sat on the floor of her room for what felt like hours, clutching the letter in my hands, until I heard the front door creak open. It was my father. He had returned earlier than planned. I hurriedly stuffed the letter into my pocket, trying to appear as calm as possible. But something in his eyes told me he already knew. "Where is Helena?" he asked, his voice harsh and cold. I tried to come up with some excuse, but my lips betrayed me with silence. He saw through me. Raising his hand, he pointed to the torn envelope I had carelessly left on the floor. His eyes blazed with fury, and I knew that my world was about to shatter. "What is this?" he demanded, stepping closer, snatching the letter from my hands and reading it. I watched as his face twisted, his expression darkening with every line he read. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, he threw the letter to the floor. You bastard," he hissed, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, pure hatred. "You've destroyed my life." I couldn't stand before him any longer. Any words I might have used to defend myself died on my lips. He stepped closer, grabbed me by the collar of my shirt, and practically shoved me out of the house. His hands trembled with rage, and I knew this was the end. Get out and never come back. Liam. His voice was so cold it felt like it cut through me. You are no longer my son. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was left standing alone on the cold autumn street. I stood there, not knowing where to go. Everything I had lost, had now turned to ashes. I felt hollow, empty, like an old house where all the lights had been extinguished. The days dragged on in a blur of confusion and despair. I rented cheap rooms in different towns, trying to forget everything that had happened. But her image haunted me in every dream, in every quiet cafe where I tried to hide from the relentless autumn rains. I tried to write, hoping the words would restore some semblance of life to me, but every page remained blank, just like my heart. My life once again became a series of faceless days in unfamiliar cities. But now it wasn't an escape from a creative block, it was an escape from myself. I had lost not only Helena. I had lost myself, my ability to dream, my belief that life could be beautiful. One day, as I sat alone in a small cafe on the outskirts of a forgotten town, I accidentally pulled out the letter I had carried with me like a talisman against the past. Her words now seemed even more painful than when I first read them. And only now did I understand. She left not because she didn't want to be with me, but because she couldn't allow herself to be happy at the cost of another person's life. Now all I was left with was this emptiness, these words that would forever haunt me. I could try to return home, but the door that had once been closed behind me would never open again.